Hello, my name is Vicki Jones, and I'm the Environmental Health Division Director with Merced County, Division of Environmental Health with the Merced County Public Health Department. My staff and I are a part of the Hazmat CUPA with Merced County, as well as we participate with the Merced County CAL FIRE Hazardous Materials Response Team as technical reference.
Vicki Jones has been the Environmental Health Division Director with the Merced County Department of Public Health, Division of Environmental Health since December 2018. Vicki has worked in the field of environmental health in various programs for the last 20 years. She has a depth of experience in the following environmental health programs, specializing in emergency response, land use, water and wells, on-site wastewater treatment systems, food, body art, recreational health, Certified Unified Program Agency, hazardous materials and hazardous waste programs, and medical waste among others. She holds a bachelor's degree in biological sciences and a master's degree in public health administration, both earned from California State University, Stanislaus. Vicki is a California registered environmental health specialist and a California certified hazardous materials specialist.
This presentation will entail a hazmat incident that Environmental Health with Merced County responded to in Los Banos, California on the west side of Merced County. And I'll speak about the hazmat incident itself, follow-up actions taken by environmental health staff, CUPA violations observed, which is the Certified Unified Program Agency, chemical mixing guidance information, and lessons learned from our response to this particular incident. On June 13th, 2019, Merced County Division of Environmental Health Emergency Response on-call staff received a call at approximately 12 p.m. regarding an unknown chemical release. Victims were at the scene. Facility or property was not properly permitted by our office for CUPA permits, and there was no hazardous materials business plan on record submitted to the California Environmental Reporting System, known as CERS, the state's online database for chemical storage reporting. Because of this, it was difficult to determine what chemicals first responders may be dealing with at the scene and what victims may have been in contact with. First responders on scene observed 3 1,000-gallon bubble-style tanks on site. This is a photo of those 3 tanks taken from a drone at the site. First responders were able to rescue one of the victims. There were 2 victims on scene. Both were affected by a hazardous materials or hazardous waste release of some kind. First responders did report a burning sensation of the eyes and skin at the site. First responders were exposed to residual fumes, but were decontaminated, transported for medical treatment, and none were severely injured. One of the victims was unfortunately deceased upon arrival of first responders. Both victims were found in close proximity to the 3 tanks. Victims were observed with what seemed to be burns and redness on their skin. When environmental health staff arrived on scene, multiple agencies were already present to provide support to the incident response. These agencies included Merced County CAL FIRE's Hazmat team, the Sheriff's Department, who was Incident Command, Merced County Department of Agriculture, Cal OSHA, and the California Department of Public Health was available by telephone to environmental health staff for consult, including a chemist. An exclusion zone of 500 feet was established. Environmental health staff on scene received safety data sheets, SDSs, for chemicals that may have been involved. At the point of the incident response, it was not known exactly what chemicals were involved or exactly what chemicals were in the tanks. The tanks did not have any placarding or identification on the tanks themselves. However, one of the witnesses at the scene was a representative from the chemical company that chemicals had been purchased from. And so this witness was able to provide SDSs for chemicals that were what was presumed to be in the 3 tanks, although it was unknown which chemical may be in which tank. Urea ammonium nitrate and calcium polysulfide are 2 fertilizers that were suspected to be in those tanks. Staff researched the chemicals from environmental health, and so we had learned urea ammonium nitrate has some important characteristics to be aware of. Heat can cause explosion detonation. Vapors can cause burns, injury, and death. And calcium polysulfide is combustible, irritating, or toxic fumes, rotten egg odor, and incompatible with acids, will cause release of hydrogen sulfide gas. There were still many uncertainties about this incident scene. We did not know if these really were the chemicals that were causing the exposure. Was the chemical release or exposure due to mixing of the chemicals, or just to one or both of the chemicals on their own? Or did weather or temperature play a role in the chemical release? And does that need to be considered in how we handle the chemicals at the site? Now that the entry team had received additional information regarding the chemicals that were potentially involved, objectives were established. One of the victims was deceased, as I had mentioned, unfortunately, at the scene prior to arrival of first responders. That victim was recovered, and to monitor for any residual chemical. Objectives were completed. Entry team was able to recover the deceased victim. No vapors or residuals were detected by air monitoring, and valves on the 3 bubble-style tanks were shut off and containers were left on the property. The tanks, however, were transferred to an isolated location since they were originally located next to a residence, and to be safe, it was decided to prevent any additional potential exposure. The tanks were relocated to a further location on the property. Environmental health staff were on site to observe sampling being conducted by CAL FIRE's Hazmat team from the suspect tanks, and to assist with HazCat testing efforts, which is chemical field identification, hazard categorization. Layers were formed in 2 of the tanks, indicating that potentially 2 different chemicals were mixed in 2 of the 3 tanks, but unknown for sure which chemicals. Unfortunately, witnesses and responders had provided information that had made that a little more difficult to determine if chemicals were mixed, and if so, which chemicals may have been mixed inside of tanks. Original reports from first responders on scene to environmental health staff was that chemical mixing may have occurred outside of the tanks into a pipe or some other type of vessel outside of the tanks. And so on scene, it seemed that the tanks may not have had mixed chemicals, but then later was found that it was possible that there could have been something inside of the tanks. And so there was information that needed to be further investigated there throughout this incident. A rotten egg odor was present at the time of sampling. However, that is a characteristic of calcium polysulfide on its own. But it could also be of another chemical caused by reaction of mixing as well. So this was more to be further investigated, and as quickly as we can to be sure we're preventing any additional injury. Samples were tested with the Hazmat kit and analyzed with the First Defender RMX, which is a monitoring device for chemicals. The First Defender RMX indicated without 100% certainty that the unknown mixture could have been nitric acid, guanidine hydrochloride, sulfur powder, and or triethylbenzene. So it didn't really give us a lot of clear information as to what was contained in each of the samples, but it did seem to point to the possibility that the chemicals we thought could be involved, being calcium polysulfide and urea ammonium nitrate, could indeed be the chemicals involved in this incident. Samples were difficult to test and analyze due to solid particles that were interfering with obtaining accurate results. And pH in 2 of the 3 tanks was 4 and 5, which was causing continued generation of what was found to be hydrogen sulfide gas. The pH needed to be greater than 8 in order to stop this reaction. And so this reaction that was generating some hydrogen sulfide gas, unknown how much or how severe that reaction was at the time when we learned that, but there was clearly a chemical reaction occurring, and we learned that the pH level, as long as it was a 4 or 5, it was too low, and that would continue the reaction as long as the pH was low and as long as the chemicals involved were still available to keep the reaction going. pH in one of the tanks was found at 11, and one of the tanks did not have any layering or precipitate or anything else involved. So it was clear then that one of the tanks was calcium polysulfide only and not a mixture. Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC's duty officer, was called by Environmental Health to request a dispatch of Park Environmental to assist with cleanup. And it was unknown if that would be an available resource. However, we learned that it was, and the request was approved. Park Environmental is a certified hazardous waste contractor, and they were on scene to assist with monitoring and proper disposal of hazardous waste generated from this incident. One problem was that based on observations made by the hazardous waste contractor, he found that 2 of those containers did indeed have a chemical reaction and off-gassing inside of the tanks. So even though air monitoring on the outside of the tanks, especially with valves closed, was not showing any signs of any off-gassing, it was still occurring inside of the tanks. And the off-gassing was hydrogen sulfide gas. As I mentioned, the hazardous waste contractor monitored for hydrogen sulfide gas around the tanks, did not detect H2S around the tanks, but once he opened the tank lid and monitored inside of the tank, he found that there was hydrogen sulfide gas being generated inside of the tanks. Due to minimal off-gassing from this ongoing acid-base reaction, being that the pH was too low, An exclusion zone of 100 feet was established, and the area was cordoned off with caution tape. At this time, the material was not able to be transported and disposed of as a hazardous waste due to the active off-gassing. This is a photo of the tanks in an agricultural field showing that there is an exclusion zone set. To prepare for hazardous waste removal after careful coordination with DTSC and the hazardous waste contractor, the hazardous waste contractor transferred the contents from the 2 bubble-style tanks into 4 275-gallon totes. The totes were then labeled as hazardous waste, and the area was fenced and locked, and caution tape was wrapped around the fence to alert anyone that could enter the premises of the hazard. This is a photo of the 4 totes, indicating that they've been secured and locked. And environmental health staff did also monitor the area and would frequently visit the site to ensure that there had been no issues or tampering with the fencing or lock. Due to sample analytical testing constraints at the local level, meaning there were no local laboratories that our division had access to that were willing to accept samples of this chemical mixture that did have ongoing off-gassing of hydrogen sulfide gas, and they were not willing to or did not have the equipment to test those mixtures. So on the local level, we were not able to find a laboratory to assist with complete full identification of contents of those samples. In an effort to fully identify the substance in the mixtures, the samples were taken by the US EPA through the hazardous waste contractor, and the samples unfortunately were never tested. There were only 2 laboratories in the western United States that could potentially conduct the testing on these samples to confirm the chemicals in the mixture: US EPA's Denver laboratory or the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Laboratory in Walnut Creek. And so those were our only 2 options, of which we needed the federal EPA or a state agency to help assist with any laboratory confirmation sampling. Environmental health staff were on site on July 18th to observe the removal of the hazardous waste totes from the property. It took quite a while to secure a location and a hauler to assist in removal and proper disposal of this hazardous waste. Again, the continuous off-gassing that these mixtures had proved to be difficult in the obtaining disposal location. The certified hazardous waste contractor was on scene to assist the certified hazardous waste hauler with safely loading the hazardous waste for transport in the presence of environmental health staff. Hazardous waste totes were removed from the property successfully and safely and taken to a treatment storage disposal facility, a TSDF, out of state to Utah for incineration. There were violations observed. So CUPA violations observed during the site visits included, and this was a farming operation, farming property, storing chemicals above threshold reporting limits without an environmental health CUPA permit for the hazardous materials and hazardous waste. No hazardous materials business plan, HMBP, was submitted to SERS, the online state database. Containers were not properly labeled or placarded to indicate what chemicals were contained within them. No, there was no hazardous waste permit for hazardous waste generated on site, and accumulating hazardous waste in unlabeled containers. Environmental health hazmat storage permits and inspections help decrease the likelihood of a hazmat incident by the following. CUPAs provide education before and after inspections are conducted. So that helps an operator or owner fully understand how best to store and transport chemicals for safety. Identifying issues at time of inspection. So there are issues that a CUPA inspector can identify on site during inspection, and if those violations can be corrected immediately on site or quickly after, it reduces and eliminates chances of illness or injury from chemical exposures. And then building a rapport with regulatory agencies, such as your local CUPA, increases the likelihood of compliance because there's good communication and there becomes a very clear understanding of what those requirements are and how to best store, label, transport chemicals and hazardous waste. And your local CUPAs are also readily available to answer questions for you. So if you do have questions, you may contact your local CUPA for assistance. Regarding chemical mixing guidance, this incident involved, unfortunately, some sort of incorrect mixing of the chemicals. It's unclear as to how the chemicals became mixed within those tanks. It's unclear if some of the chemical was in the tank that was not known about before other chemicals added, or if chemicals were added in an improper order, or if chemicals were added too quickly, or some other component of that. In any case, there was some sort of concern with how the chemicals or what chemicals were mixed in those tanks that led to this unfortunate, horrific accident. We always want to make sure that you follow instructions on a chemical label. That is extremely important. If a label or a safety data sheet specifically indicates not to mix something together, please follow those directions. If you must mix certain chemicals together or chemicals with water, ensure to read labels, SDSs, and use extreme caution. Make sure you're always wearing proper personal protective equipment, and especially respiratory equipment. There is a jar test that can be conducted, also known as a bench test, which basically helps you determine physical compatibility of chemicals or chemicals with water when mixing. It basically makes it much easier to manage if you can identify incompatibilities in smaller amounts, because then those are much more easily handled on a smaller level and you're generating much less hazardous waste. And so there are some recommendations in how to conduct a jar test for liquids, solids, and pesticides. Incompatibility is typically, not always, but typically there is some physical evidence of incompatibility when you're mixing chemicals. And that's evident by the formation of clumps or scum on top, or solids or precipitate. If there's a lot of cloudiness, if there's separation layers, and heat generated. Incompatibility may cause damage to tools or equipment due to improper order of mixing or inadequate agitation. This is an example of the jar test, and in this case, showing incompatible chemicals being mixed due to a precipitate formed on the bottom and separation layers observed. So this is an indication of incompatibility. Recommendations regarding chemical mixing are the following. Check product labels and safety data sheets regarding incompatibility issues. Check with your chemical company experts before attempting mixing chemicals or fertilizers. Always wear proper personal protective equipment, including respiratory protection. Add materials slowly, checking for incompatibility issues. Monitor your mixture over a few hours for incompatibility issues. A reaction is possible to occur after a few hours of mixing, so the incompatibility may not be obvious within minutes. It may take an hour or two or so after mixing to notice there's an incompatibility problem. Pay attention to pH changes and physical changes. Always consult with professionals and follow the directions provided on the manufacturer labels and SDSs. For additional guidance, there is very good information on this topic found at these websites from these different college institutions. There were some lessons learned from the response to this incident. Information regarding symptoms, odors, and any other physical characteristics of the chemicals on scene, and even aspects of the scene itself, are very important, such as containers, piping. Information that's very specific to the scene should be reported to the technical reference Hazmat team staff and other responding agencies as quickly as possible to help identify all hazards. So an improved communication flow is always something that is important when involving many team members on a response on scene. We just want to make sure that everything is being explored, everything is being researched, so we can quickly come to the proper chemicals and address those chemicals as quickly as possible to reduce any additional injury or death at a site. Following regulations and wearing proper PPE prevents serious and fatal accidents. So definitely, it is very important to follow regulations and to wear PPE that's required for the chemicals being worked with, including respiratory protection. That is, in this instance, was of utmost importance, and definitely always important when handling or mixing chemicals that could have negative respiratory effects. This is contact information for the Merced County CUPA. If you have any questions and you're a Merced County business, feel free to give us a call or an email. We're happy to answer questions for you. And thank you for masking for safety. Have a great day.